The law office smelled like old leather and disappointment. I sat in the burgundy chair across from William Cross, watching him shuffle through my father's final papers with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this dance 1,000 times before. Margaret squeezed my hand, her wedding ring catching the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Richard," Cross said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Harold was a good man. A very good man. 6 months. That's how long Dad had fought the cancer before it finally won. 6 months of chemotherapy, radiation, hope, and watching the strongest man I'd ever known waste away to nothing." Margaret had been incredible through it all, taking time off from her paralegal job at Hartley and Associates, driving him to appointments when I couldn't get away from the construction site, making sure he took his medications on schedule. "The primary estate goes to you, of course," Cross continued, sliding a document across the mahogany desk. "The house on Maple Street, your father's shares in Vance Construction, the investment accounts at Merrill Lynch and Chase. There are also charitable donations as your father requested. 50,000 to the American Cancer Society. Pension provisions for his longtime employees, Frank Morrison and Betty Meyer." I nodded, trying to process the numbers. Dad had built his construction company from nothing back in 1985, starting with just a pickup truck and a toolbox. Apparently, he'd done much better financially than I'd realized. The inheritance would change everything for Margaret and me. We could finally pay off our mortgage, maybe start the family we'd been talking about for 3 years. "The total estate value comes to approximately $1.8 million, Cross explained, his voice carrying the weight of the figure. "Your father was quite the businessman." Margaret gasped beside me. "Richard, did you know?" "I knew the company was successful, but not like this," I admitted. Dad had always been modest about money, driving the same Ford pickup for 15 years and living in the same modest ranch house he'd bought when I was 10. "There is one more thing," Cross said, his voice dropping slightly. He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a sealed manila envelope. My name was written across it in Dad's unmistakable handwriting, along with the words, "Open privately, personal matter." "Your father was very specific about this," Cross explained, tapping the envelope with his index finger. "He wanted you to receive this after the formal reading, and he wanted you to open it alone. He came in specifically to prepare this about 6 months ago, shortly after his diagnosis." Margaret leaned forward, her paralegal instincts kicking in. "What kind of personal matter? Is there something that affects the estate distribution?" Cross's expression remained carefully neutral. "I'm afraid I don't know the contents. Harold was quite insistent about privacy. He sealed it himself in my presence and asked me to give it to Richard after the formal proceedings." "That seems unusual," Margaret pressed. "In my experience with estate planning, private letters are usually for emotional matters, not legal ones." "Perhaps," Cross replied diplomatically, "but Harold was very clear about his wishes." The drive home took us through downtown Springfield, past the construction sites where I'd worked alongside Dad during high school summers. Margaret chattered excitedly about the inheritance, pulling out her phone to research kitchen renovation ideas and European vacation packages. "We could finally get that Viking range I've been wanting," she said, scrolling through appliance websites. "And maybe add the master bathroom suite. God, Richard, we're actually wealthy now? Can you believe it?" "It doesn't feel real yet," I admitted, the envelope burning a hole in my jacket pocket. "Dad never acted like he had this kind of money." "Your father was old-fashioned about discussing finances," Margaret said, squeezing my knee as we stopped at a red light. "Remember how embarrassed he got when I asked about his retirement planning last year? He probably didn't want you to feel pressure about the inheritance." I found myself only half listening, my mind fixated on that envelope. What could Dad have wanted to tell me privately that he couldn't say while he was alive? During his final weeks in hospice, we'd talked about everything: my childhood, his regrets, his pride in the man I'd become. What could he have left unsaid? "Earth to Richard," Margaret laughed as we pulled into our driveway. "You're a million miles away." "Just processing everything," I said. "It's a lot to absorb." She leaned over and kissed my cheek, her perfume familiar and comforting. "I know, honey." Your dad would be so proud of how you handled everything. The funeral arrangements, the medical decisions, dealing with all his business affairs. You were an amazing son. I couldn't have done it without you, I said, and meant it. Margaret had been my anchor during Dad's illness, handling logistics when I was too emotional to think straight, researching treatment options, coordinating with doctors and nurses. That's what marriage means, she said softly, supporting each other through the hard times. Why don't you go decompress in your office while I start dinner? I picked up those ribeye steaks you like. My home office had always been my sanctuary, the one room in the house that was entirely mine, with my engineering textbooks, project blueprints, and the photographs chronicling 3 generations of Vance construction, pictures of Dad and his father breaking ground on their first commercial project. Dad and me at various construction sites over the years, both of us wearing hard hats and genuine smiles. The office held 20 years of memories. I closed the door behind me and sat at my desk, staring at the envelope. Dad's handwriting was shakier than usual, evidence of the tremor that had developed during his chemotherapy treatments. Whatever he'd written, it had been important enough to prepare during the worst period of his illness. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal. Inside was a USB drive and a single sheet of paper covered in Dad's careful script. Son, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and the truth is finally yours to know. I had my attorney preserve evidence of Margaret's betrayal. What you'll find will be painful but necessary. She manipulated both of us, but I was too proud and too sick to tell you while I was alive. The evidence is legally sound. William Cross made sure of that. Everything was obtained through proper channels to ensure admissibility if you choose to pursue justice. I'm sorry I failed to protect you from her, but perhaps this final gift can set you free. She has stolen from both of us, Richard. Don't let her steal your future too. Love always, Dad. My hands shook as I read the note 3 times, trying to process the words. Betrayal? Margaret had betrayed us? The woman who'd spent countless hours at Dad's bedside, who'd researched experimental treatments, who'd held my hand through the worst grief of my life. I inserted the USB drive into my computer with numb fingers. The contents made my blood run cold. Dozens of folders organized by date and category, containing emails, financial documents, medical correspondence, and legal filings. Everything was professionally organized, like a legal case file prepared for court. The main folder was labeled Timeline of Deception, January 2022 to present. Inside were subfolders, email evidence, financial exploitation, medical manipulation, family isolation, and legal documentation. I opened the email folder first, my cursor hovering over files dated 18 months ago. The sender was Margaret's personal Gmail account, the one she used for online shopping and correspondence with her sister in California. The recipient was my father's email address. The subject line of the first email read, "Thank you for last night. Harold, I can't stop thinking about our conversation over dinner at Romano's. You make me feel things Richard never has, like I'm truly understood and appreciated. I know this is complicated given our relationship, but I can't deny how I feel anymore. You see me in ways your son never will." My father's response, sent an hour later. Margaret, you mean everything to me. Richard is lucky to have you, but I understand what you're saying. You deserve someone who appreciates your intelligence and compassion. We should talk more when you come for my appointment Tuesday. I've been looking forward to our time together. I scrolled through dozens of similar exchanges, watching my marriage crumble in real time through archived emails. Margaret writing about how emotionally unavailable I was, how she felt more connected to my father than to me. Dad responding with increasing affection, telling her she deserved better than a workaholic son who doesn't appreciate her remarkable qualities. The emails spanned nearly 2 years, growing progressively more intimate. Margaret complaining about our sex life, our lack of deep conversations, my focus on work. Dad commiserating, offering emotional support, gradually positioning himself as the understanding father figure she'd never had. Richard comes home exhausted every night and barely acknowledges I exist, Margaret had written 6 months ago. Sometimes I feel like I'm married to a stranger. You're the only person who really listens to me anymore. Dad's response. You deserve so much more than Richard gives you. You're an extraordinary woman. Intelligent, beautiful, caring. If I were 30 years younger and not his father, things would be different between us. Sometimes I wish you were 30 years younger, Margaret had replied, or that Richard was more like you. The financial folder was even worse. Screenshots of bank statements showing large transfers from Dad's accounts to Margaret's personal savings. A pattern emerged quickly. Every few weeks, transfers of $5,000 to $15,000, always with innocuous memo lines like household expenses or medical supplies. Insurance policy modifications listing Margaret as a secondary beneficiary on Dad's $200,000 life insurance policy. Property deed transfers I'd never known about, including the vacation cabin in Lake George that Dad had supposedly sold last year to help pay for medical expenses. Except he hadn't sold it to strangers. He'd transferred the deed to Margaret for $1, the legal minimum for a property transfer. Bank signature cards showing Margaret had been added to Dad's checking and savings accounts with full withdrawal privileges. Investment account modifications giving her power of attorney over Dad's retirement portfolio. A systematic financial takeover that had occurred while I thought she was simply helping Dad manage his medical bills. But it was the medical correspondence folder that made me physically sick. Email after email between Margaret and Dad's medical team, with Margaret positioned as his primary caregiver and medical advocate. Messages showing how she'd systematically excluded me from medical appointments, telling doctors and nurses that I was too busy with work, commitments to participate in Dad's care. Dr. Santos, Richard won't be able to make Tuesday's chemotherapy consultation. He's dealing with a major project deadline at Advanced Construction and asked me to attend in his place. I'll be there to take notes and handle any questions about Harold's treatment plan. Thank you for being so accommodating. Margaret Vance, Harold's daughter-in-law and designated caregiver. Margaret, thanks for coordinating Harold's care so efficiently. It's wonderful that he has such dedicated family support during this difficult time. We'll see you Tuesday at 2 p.m. for the consultation with the oncology team. Dr. Elizabeth Santos *. I remembered that appointment. I'd specifically asked Margaret to reschedule it so I could attend, explaining that the Morrison Shopping Center project could wait. She'd told me Dr. Santos couldn't accommodate the change, that Dad understood I was too busy with the critical phase of construction. I'd felt guilty for weeks, believing I'd failed my father during a crucial medical decision. The timestamps on the emails told the real story. For nearly 2 years, Margaret had been conducting an emotional affair with my dying father while systematically isolating me from his care. She'd positioned herself as his primary advocate and confidant, then used that access to manipulate him into changing his will, transferring assets to her name, and excluding me from medical decisions. Another folder contained correspondence with Dad's financial advisor, where Margaret had convinced him to modify investment beneficiaries, emails with his insurance agent about policy changes, messages with his lawyer about estate planning updates. She'd used her paralegal knowledge to navigate these systems efficiently, knowing exactly which forms to file and which documentation to provide. "Honey, dinner's ready," Margaret's voice called from downstairs, cheerful and domestic. I quickly closed the files and ejected the USB drive, my mind reeling. The woman who'd comforted me through Dad's funeral, who'd held me while I cried, who'd taken care of the man I loved most in the world. She'd been systematically stealing from us both while conducting an emotional affair that had lasted nearly 2 years. At dinner, I watched Margaret cut her ribeye steak and talk enthusiastically about her day at Hartley and Associates, where she'd been working as a paralegal for the past 5 years. How fitting that she'd used her legal knowledge to exploit my father with such sophisticated precision. Patricia Williams complimented my work on the Morrison estate settlement today, she said, referring to her supervisor. She said I have excellent attention to detail with financial documentation. I'm thinking about pursuing my paralegal certification upgrade next year. That's great, I managed, forcing myself to take a bite of steak that tasted like cardboard. With the inheritance, I could take time off to study properly. Maybe even consider law school if the LSAT goes well. She reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Your dad's gift is going to change our whole future, Richard. We can finally have the life we've dreamed about. You're quiet tonight, she observed, reaching across to touch my forehead. Are you feeling okay? You've barely touched your dinner. Just tired, I managed. It's been a long day. A lot to process. Of course it has. Losing your dad, dealing with all the estate details. But at least the hard part is over now. We can start focusing on the future instead of just surviving each day. I nearly choked on my water. The hard part was just beginning. I was thinking we should plan a memorial trip, Margaret continued, cutting another piece of steak. Somewhere your dad always wanted to travel but never got the chance. Maybe Ireland. He used to talk about tracing his family roots there. The irony was suffocating. Dad had wanted to take that trip for years, but Margaret had convinced him to transfer the money he'd saved for it into an account she controlled, ostensibly for medical expenses. That night, while Margaret slept beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Every memory of the past 2 years felt poisoned now. Margaret volunteering to take Dad to chemotherapy appointments because it gave her alone time to manipulate him. Margaret staying late at Dad's house to help with paperwork because she was convincing him to sign financial documents. Margaret crying at his funeral, playing the devoted daughter-in-law while secretly inheriting hundreds of thousands of dollars. I remembered the night Dad had asked me about my marriage, whether Margaret and I were happy together. I'd told him we were working through some challenges, but that Margaret was wonderful. He'd looked sad and said, "Sometimes the people closest to us see things we can't." At the time, I thought he was offering general wisdom about relationships. Now I realized he'd been trying to warn me. The next morning, I called in sick to work, the first time I'd done so in 3 years, and drove straight to William Cross's office. His secretary, Mrs. Patterson, recognized me immediately. "Richard, how are you holding up, dear? Your father was such a lovely man." "I need to speak with Mr. Cross urgently," I said. "It's about the envelope." "Of course. Let me see if he's available." Cross appeared in his office doorway within minutes, still holding his morning coffee. "Richard, I wasn't expecting to see you so soon. How are you holding up?" "I need to ask you some questions about that envelope," I said, closing his office door behind me. "How long did my father work with you on this?" Cross studied my face carefully, probably reading the stress and exhaustion written there. "I take it you've reviewed the contents?" "Every word, every document." "How is this even legal? Did you help him spy on his own daughter-in-law?" He gestured for me to sit down in the same chair I'd occupied the day before. "Let me explain exactly what happened. Your father came to me about 8 months ago with concerns about Margaret's influence over him. He felt he was being manipulated but wasn't sure how to prove it or what to do about it. So you decided to investigate her. We worked together to document everything through proper legal channels," Cross corrected firmly. "Nothing on that drive was obtained illegally. Every email was exported from accounts your father owned or had legal access to. Every financial document came from institutions where he was the primary account holder. Every piece of medical correspondence involved him as the patient with full rights to his own records." I leaned back in my chair, processing this. He knew. He knew what she was doing, and he built a case against her. Harold was sharper than people gave him credit for, even while battling cancer. He recognized manipulation tactics that many people miss entirely. He wanted to protect you from further exploitation. Further exploitation. Cross opened a file cabinet and withdrew a thick folder. "Richard, what you saw on that USB drive represents only the documented evidence. Your father suspected Margaret's manipulation began much earlier, possibly within the first year of your marriage." "That's impossible. We've been married 4 years. Margaret has been nothing but supportive." "Has she?" Cross asked gently. "Think about it. When did you start working longer hours? When did you begin feeling guilty about spending time with friends and family? When did Margaret become your primary connection to your father's daily life?" The questions hit like physical blows. I had started working longer hours about 3 years ago, right around the time Margaret had suggested I focus on growing the business to secure our future. I had started declining social invitations because Margaret often felt left out or uncomfortable in groups. And she had gradually become the primary conduit for information about Dad's health, activities, and state of mind. What are my legal options here? I asked. Cross pulled out a legal pad and began writing. Multiple avenues, criminal prosecution for elder abuse and fraud. These are serious felonies in this state. Civil litigation to recover the assets she obtained through manipulation and undue influence. Professional misconduct charges through the State Bar Association, since she violated numerous ethics rules by exploiting her legal knowledge to defraud a vulnerable client. A vulnerable client? Your father technically became Margaret's client when she began handling his legal and medical affairs. As a paralegal, she had professional obligations and ethical responsibilities that she violated spectacularly. What kind of penalties are we talking about? Criminal penalties could include significant prison time. Elder abuse with financial exploitation carries a maximum sentence of 10 years. Professional penalties would include permanent disbarment, making her unemployable in any legal capacity. Civil penalties could include full restitution plus punitive damages. I spent the next hour learning about elder abuse laws, fiduciary responsibilities, and the various ways Margaret had committed both misdemeanors and felonies. By the time I left Cross's office, I had a clear understanding of what came next and a timeline for action. But first, I needed to understand the full scope of Margaret's deception. The family isolation folder on the USB drive contained contact information for relatives I hadn't spoken to in months. I started with Uncle James, Dad's younger brother, who lived about an hour away in Albany. Richard, I was just thinking about you. How are you holding up after Harold's funeral? I've been meaning to call, but didn't want to intrude during your grieving process. Uncle James, I need to ask you something important. When Dad was sick, did you try to visit him? There was a pause. Of course I did. Multiple times. But Margaret said you all needed space to process everything, that Harold was too weak for visitors most days. She said he was having trouble with his immune system and couldn't risk exposure to additional people. My stomach dropped. She said what? She was very apologetic about it. Said you were overwhelmed trying to manage his care while keeping up with work responsibilities. I called several times to check on Harold, but Margaret always answered and said she was handling communication to reduce stress on both of you. Uncle James, I never asked for family to stay away. I wanted you there. I wanted everyone there. But Margaret said, he stopped mid-sentence. Richard, what are you telling me? I'm telling you that Margaret lied to both of us. She kept you away from Dad and made me think you weren't interested in being involved. Another long pause. Jesus Christ. Richard, I thought you didn't want us around. Margaret made it sound like you'd specifically requested that family give you space to handle everything privately. What exactly did she tell you? She said you were working 16-hour days to keep up with medical expenses and couldn't handle coordinating family visits on top of everything else. She said Harold understood and preferred quiet time anyway, because the treatment made him so tired. Did you ever talk to Dad directly? I tried calling his house phone several times, but Margaret always answered. She said he was sleeping, or having treatment, or too weak to talk. She promised to give him my messages and said he appreciated my concern but needed to focus his energy on fighting the cancer. The conversation with my cousin Sarah was even worse. Margaret had told her that I was overwhelmed and had specifically asked family to give us space during Dad's treatment. Sarah had wanted to help with meals, transportation, house cleaning, anything. But Margaret said I'd requested that family not interfere with the care routine they'd established. I feel terrible, Sarah said, her voice breaking. I thought you didn't want our help. I thought you and Margaret had everything under control and we'd just be getting in the way. Sarah, when did you talk to Margaret about this? Multiple times over the past year. The last time was about 2 months before Harold passed. I called to ask if I could bring dinner or help with grocery shopping, and Margaret said you were stressed about work deadlines and didn't want additional coordination responsibilities. Did you ever talk to Dad about this? I tried calling him directly a few times, but Margaret said he was having cognitive problems from the chemotherapy and got confused easily when too many people called. She said it was better to route everything through her so she could update him when he was having good days. By the end of the day, I'd spoken to 8 family members and close friends who'd all received similar messages from Margaret. She'd systematically isolated Dad from his support network while positioning herself as our overwhelmed but dedicated caregiver and advocate. Every person I talked to had believed Margaret's explanations and had backed off from offering help or maintaining regular contact. My father's older sister, Aunt Dorothy, had even sent money to help with medical expenses after Margaret called her crying about the financial strain we were under. She said you were too proud to ask for help, but that Harold needed experimental treatments insurance wouldn't cover, Dorothy explained. I sent $2,000 and told her to call if you needed more. She said Harold was so grateful but didn't want Richard to know because it would make him feel like a failure as a provider. Aunt Dorothy, I never knew about any experimental treatments. What was she talking about? Some clinical trial in Boston. Margaret said Harold qualified, but you couldn't afford the travel and lodging expenses. She said she was using her savings but didn't want to burden you with additional financial stress. I called Dr. Santos immediately. Dr. Santos, this is Richard Vance. I need to ask you about experimental treatments for my father. Did you ever recommend a clinical trial in Boston? Richard, number. Harold wasn't a candidate for any clinical trials. His cancer was too advanced by the time of diagnosis. Where did you hear about Boston? Margaret told my family that Dad needed expensive experimental treatment that insurance wouldn't cover. Dr. Santos was quiet for a long moment. Richard, I think you and I need to have a conversation. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? That evening, I confronted Margaret, starting with the family isolation issue. Margaret, I need to ask you about something. I talked to Uncle James today. He said you told him we didn't want family visits while Dad was sick. Her expression didn't change, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes, the same look she got when opposing counsel challenged her research during depositions at work. I was trying to protect you both, she said carefully. Your dad was so weak, and you were already stressed about work and medical bills. I thought limiting visitors would reduce complications. Complications? Richard, you were barely holding it together. Adding family drama and coordination responsibilities would have made everything worse. Your uncle means well, but he can be overwhelming with his opinions and suggestions. That wasn't your decision to make. Now she set down her wine glass, her voice taking on the patient tone she used when she thought I was being unreasonable. Honey, I was trying to help. I know your family means well, but they can be emotionally exhausting. Remember your aunt's cancer cure suggestions, the dietary supplements, and alternative medicine theories? Your dad didn't need that stress while fighting for his life. She was good. Even knowing what I knew, she was almost convincing. What about Dr. Santos? You told her I couldn't make appointments because of work deadlines. Margaret's pause was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. Sometimes you couldn't. The Morrison Project was consuming your life, and someone needed to be there for the medical consultations. I specifically asked you to reschedule the appointment on March 15th so I could attend. You said, Doctor, Santos couldn't accommodate the change. Richard, I don't remember every scheduling detail from 8 months ago. I was juggling your dad's care, my own job responsibilities, and trying to support you through the worst period of your life. I called Dr. Santos today. She said she never told you she couldn't reschedule appointments. She said you told her I was too busy to participate in Dad's care. Margaret stood up abruptly, her wine glass forgotten. Richard, what is this? Are you accusing me of something? I'm asking you to explain why my father's doctor thinks I abandoned him during his cancer treatment. That's ridiculous. Dr. Santos knows how much you cared about your dad. Everyone knows you were doing everything possible while trying to keep the business running. Does she? Because according to her notes, she was under the impression that you were Dad's primary family support because his son was too focused on work obligations to help with medical care. Margaret's face flushed red, anger replacing her careful composure. I don't know why you're attacking me like this. I did everything I could to help your father and support you through the worst time of your life. If you have problems with how I handled things, maybe you should have been more involved instead of leaving everything to me. It was a masterful deflection, turning the conversation back to my supposed failures as a son. But I was ready for it. You're right, I said. I should have been more involved. That's why I'm going to start being very involved in understanding exactly what happened over the past 2 years. What does that mean? It means I'm going to investigate every medical appointment, every financial transaction, every conversation you had on Dad's behalf. I'm going to talk to every family member and friend who offered help. I'm going to find out exactly what you told everyone and why my father died thinking his son was too busy to care about him. Margaret's composure cracked completely. Richard, you're scaring me. I don't understand why you're turning against me like this. We're supposed to be a team. Teams don't lie to each other for 2 years. I never lied to you. You told Dr. Santos I was too busy to participate in Dad's medical care. You were busy. You told my family I asked them to stay away. I was trying to protect everyone. You told Dad I was emotionally unavailable and didn't appreciate you. Margaret's face went white. How could you possibly know that? The question hung in the air between us. Margaret realized immediately that she'd revealed too much, but it was too late. So, you admit you told him that? Richard, your father was lonely and scared. He needed someone to talk to, someone who understood what he was going through. If I provided emotional support when you couldn't, that doesn't make me a bad person. What else did you provide? What do you mean? What else did you provide to my lonely, scared father while I was supposedly too busy to care about him? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her mind clearly racing. If you're implying something inappropriate happened between your father and me, that's disgusting. He was like a father to me. A father who left you money in his will? Harold wanted to help secure our future. He knew I'd sacrificed my career advancement to take care of him. How much money, Margaret? I don't know what you're talking about. How much money did my father leave you? Richard, this conversation is ridiculous. You're upset about losing your dad, and you're looking for someone to blame. But I'm not your enemy. Answer the question. How much money? Your father made some provisions for my retirement account. He was grateful for my help and wanted to show his appreciation. How much? It's not about the money, Richard. It's about Harold wanting to take care of people who took care of him. How much money did my dead father leave to my wife? Margaret broke. 200,000. Plus the cabin at Lake George. He said you'd understand when you saw how much I'd given up to help him. That night, Margaret claimed she had a headache and went to bed early. I heard her talking quietly on her phone in the bathroom, but couldn't make out the words. When she came out, her eyes were red and she avoided looking at me directly. Everything okay? I asked. Just tired. It's been a stressful conversation. I hate that you think I did something wrong when I was just trying to help everyone. I don't think you did something wrong, Margaret. I know you did something wrong. What does that mean? It means tomorrow I'm going to start figuring out exactly what you did and how you did it. The next morning, I met with Detective Maria Rodriguez at the district attorney's office. Cross had made the introduction after I'd called him at 6 a.m. to request an urgent meeting. This is actually a very comprehensive case, Rodriguez said, flipping through printed copies of the USB drive contents. Most elder abuse cases are much harder to prove because the perpetrators are careful not to leave paper trails. Your father essentially built the prosecution case for us. What kind of charges are we talking about? Multiple felonies. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, fraud, conspiracy, possibly forgery depending on how she obtained some of these asset transfers. Each charge carries significant prison time. How long would a case like this take? Months, potentially years depending on whether she pleads guilty or demands a trial. But with evidence this solid, I'd expect plea negotiations long before we get to trial. What do I need to do? Cooperate with our investigation. We'll need formal statements, access to additional financial records, contact information for family members who can testify about the isolation tactics. This is going to be a thorough investigation. I spent the morning learning about the criminal justice process, then drove to the State Bar Association offices in downtown Springfield to file a formal complaint against Margaret's paralegal license. Professional misconduct of this magnitude usually results in permanent disbarment, explained Janet Morrison, the ethics investigator assigned to my case. She used her legal knowledge and position of trust to systematically defraud a vulnerable client. This is exactly the kind of behavior the licensing system exists to prevent and punish. What's the timeline for that process? Faster than criminal proceedings. We can suspend her license immediately pending investigation, and the formal hearing process typically takes 3 to 6 months. With evidence this clear, I'd expect permanent revocation. Will this affect her current employment? Most law firms have clauses requiring immediate termination if an employee's professional license is suspended. She'll likely be unemployed within days of our initial action. That afternoon, I received a call from Margaret's supervisor at Hartley & Associates. Mr. Vance, this is Patricia Williams from Hartley & Associates. I understand you filed complaints regarding Margaret's conduct with elderly clients. Yes, ma'am. Specifically regarding her exploitation of my father during his cancer treatment. I want you to know we're conducting our own internal investigation immediately. If these allegations are substantiated, Margaret's employment will be terminated without notice. We have zero tolerance for attorneys or paralegals who exploit their legal knowledge for personal gain. How quickly will you know? We're meeting with Margaret tomorrow morning to review the allegations. Depending on her responses, we may terminate immediately or place her on unpaid suspension pending the outcome of criminal and licensing investigations. That evening, Margaret arrived home from work earlier than usual, her face pale and drawn. She'd clearly been crying. Richard, we need to talk. About what? Patricia Williams called me into a meeting tomorrow morning. Someone filed a complaint about my work with elderly clients. They're investigating my professional conduct. Really? What kind of complaint? They wouldn't give me details, but they mentioned your father specifically. Richard, did you file a complaint against me with my employer? I filed several complaints about your conduct. Your employer, the State Bar Association, and the District Attorney's Office. Margaret sat down heavily on our couch, her hands shaking. Richard, you could destroy my career, everything I've worked for. Why would you do this to me? Because you destroyed my relationship with my father. Because you stole from both of us. Because you lied to everyone who cared about Dad and made them think I didn't want their help. I was trying to protect everyone. You were trying to control everyone. There's a difference. Richard, please. We can work this out. If you withdraw the complaints, we can go to counseling, figure out how to communicate better. I love you. I love our marriage. Do you? Or do you love my inheritance? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. That's not fair. You're right. It's not fair that you spent 2 years manipulating my dying father into believing his son didn't care about him. It's not fair that you systematically excluded me from his medical care while positioning yourself as his primary advocate. It's not fair that you stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from him while he was fighting cancer. I didn't steal anything. Harold gave me that money because he was grateful for my help and wanted to secure our future together. Our future? Or your future with him? Richard, that's disgusting. Nothing inappropriate happened between your father and me. Maybe not physically, but emotionally. You had an affair with my father, Margaret. A 2-year emotional affair while he was dying and I was working myself to death trying to keep everything together. That's not what happened. I read the emails. All of them. 2 years of you telling my father how much more you appreciated him than me, how you felt more connected to him than to your own husband, how you wished he was 30 years younger. Margaret's face crumpled. Richard, you don't understand. Your father was lonely. He needed someone to talk to about things he couldn't discuss with you. What things? His fears about dying, his regrets about his relationship with you, his worries about leaving you with financial responsibilities. He needed emotional support that you couldn't provide because you were dealing with your own grief. So you decided to provide that support in exchange for money? It wasn't like that. The money was Harold's idea. He wanted to take care of me because he knew how much I'd sacrificed. Sacrificed? You mean you sacrificed having a normal marriage so you could have an emotional affair with my father? It wasn't an affair. What would you call it? Margaret was quiet for a long time. I would call it caring about someone who was dying and needed emotional support his own son was too busy to provide. His own son was excluded from providing support by the woman he trusted most in the world. 3 days later, Margaret was arrested at her office during the lunch hour. I was at the construction site when Cross called to give me the update. They picked her up about an hour ago, he said. The charges are substantial. 5 felony counts including elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and financial exploitation. Bail is set at $50,000. Will she make bail? Probably. But the arrest will trigger immediate suspension of her paralegal license and automatic termination from Hartley and Associates. Her professional life is over regardless of the criminal outcome. That evening, Margaret called from the county jail. Richard, you have to help me. This is insane. They're saying I stole from your father, that I manipulated him into giving me money. You know that's not true. Do I? Of course you do. I loved your dad like he was my own father. I took care of him when you couldn't be there. I made sure he had everything he needed, including access to his bank accounts. Richard, please. Whatever they told you, whatever they think they have, it's all misunderstood. Your dad was grateful for my help. He wanted to take care of me because he knew how much I'd given up to help him. What did you give up? My time, my energy, my career advancement. I turned down a promotion at Hartley and Associates because I was spending so much time helping Harold. I used my vacation days and sick leave to take him to medical appointments. I sacrificed our social life because someone needed to be available for his care. And in return, he gave you $200,000. Richard, I love you. We're married. We're supposed to be a team. If Harold wanted to show his appreciation by helping secure our future, that was his choice as a grown man. Our future? You mean your future? I don't understand the difference. The difference is that you had an emotional affair with my father while systematically excluding me from his care. You made him believe I was too busy to love him while you positioned yourself as the only person who truly cared about him. Richard, you were busy. The Morrison Project, the Davidson renovation, the new office building downtown. You were working 16-hour days and barely had time to sleep, let alone provide the kind of emotional support a dying man needs. Because you told everyone I was too busy. You told Dr. Santos I couldn't attend medical appointments. You told my family I didn't want their help. You told Dad I was emotionally unavailable. You created the situation where I appeared to be an absent son, then swooped in to fill the void you'd created. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Richard, I need a lawyer. Yeah, you do. Will you post bail for me? No. Richard, I'm your wife. You're a stranger who's been lying to me for 2 years. Please, I can't stay in jail. I'll lose my job, my professional license, everything I've worked for. You already lost your job. Hartley and Associates terminated you this afternoon. The state bar suspended your license this morning. Everything you worked for is gone. Richard, please. I love you. Whatever I did wrong, we can fix this. What you did wrong was commit multiple felonies against my dying father. There's no fixing that. The criminal case moved faster than expected. Margaret's attorney, David Meyer, was expensive but realistic about the evidence. The prosecution has everything, Cross told me, after a conference with both legal teams. Emails, financial records, medical correspondence, bank transfers, witness statements from family members. Meyer knows he can't win at trial. So what happens now? Plea negotiations. Meyer will try to minimize the charges and prison time, but Rodriguez holds all the cards here. How long are we talking about for financial exploitation of this magnitude? Probably 3 to 5 years in state prison, plus restitution and probation. Margaret's life as she knew it is over. While the criminal case proceeded, I filed civil lawsuits to recover the assets Margaret had fraudulently obtained. The vacation cabin deed was the easiest to challenge. The transfer had been made while Dad was undergoing intensive chemotherapy, and Margaret had used her paralegal knowledge to structure it in a way that avoided typical safeguards designed to protect vulnerable adults. She knew exactly how to exploit the system, explained my civil attorney, Rebecca Foster. She understood which asset transfers would raise red flags and which would slip through unnoticed. It's sophisticated fraud executed by someone with insider knowledge of legal processes. The financial recovery process was methodical but satisfying. Bank accounts were frozen pending resolution of the criminal case. Insurance beneficiaries were changed back to the original designations after the insurance company investigated the circumstances of the modifications. Property transfers were challenged one by one through civil court proceedings. Margaret's professional destruction was swift and comprehensive. The State Bar Association moved quickly on permanent license revocation after reviewing the evidence. Her law firm's internal investigation resulted in immediate termination and a company-wide memo about ethical violations. Hartley and Associates has terminated Margaret Vance's employment effective immediately, Patricia Williams announced in a letter to all firm clients. We are cooperating fully with law enforcement and regulatory investigations into her conduct. This firm maintains the highest ethical standards and will not tolerate any violation of client trust. The local legal community was small enough that word spread quickly. Margaret would never work in law again, anywhere in the state. 8 months after Dad's funeral, Margaret accepted a plea bargain: 3 years in state prison, 4 years supervised probation, and full restitution of $427,000 to Dad's estate. The judge's comments during sentencing were particularly harsh. Ms. Vance, you exploited your legal knowledge and position of trust to systematically defraud a vulnerable cancer patient, Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. You manipulated both the victim and his son while enriching yourself through sophisticated financial crimes. This behavior represents a profound betrayal of professional ethics and human decency. Margaret's victim impact statement was a masterpiece of deflection and self-pity. She talked about her genuine love for Dad, her sacrifices during his illness, her belief that he wanted to provide for our future. She painted herself as a misunderstood caregiver whose dedication had been criminalized by an ungrateful stepson. Harold Vance was like a father to me, she told the court, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. I gave up career opportunities to care for him during the most difficult period of his life. If he chose to show his appreciation through financial gifts, that was his decision as a competent adult. I never coerced or manipulated him. My statement was shorter and more direct. Your Honor, Margaret didn't just steal money from my father. She stole his final months with his family. She made him believe his son was too busy to care about him while she positioned herself as his only source of emotional support. She isolated him from relatives who wanted to help, excluded me from medical decisions, and conducted a 2-year emotional affair while he was dying. She robbed us both of the relationship we should have had during his last year of life. No amount of restitution can give that back to us. The civil case took longer to resolve, winding through the court system over 18 months of depositions, discovery, and settlement negotiations. Eventually, Margaret's assets were liquidated to pay the judgment. The vacation cabin was returned to Dad's estate, along with the contents of several bank accounts she'd established with transferred funds. Her retirement account was seized, her car was sold, and a lien was placed on any future earnings. By the time the legal proceedings concluded, Margaret had lost everything: her freedom, her career, her professional reputation, her marriage, and her financial security. She would serve 3 years in the Women's Correctional Facility, followed by 4 years of supervised probation, during which her finances would be monitored to ensure continued restitution payments. 18 months after Dad's death, I sat in the same law office where this all began, signing papers to establish the Harold Vance Foundation for Elder Abuse Prevention. Your father would be proud, Cross said, watching me sign the incorporation documents. He'd be amazed that his final gift accomplished so much beyond protecting your inheritance. What do you mean? Richard, when Harold first came to me with concerns about Margaret, he was primarily worried about protecting your inheritance and maintaining your relationship. He had no idea the evidence we collected would expose such systematic abuse, or that the case would become a model for elder abuse prosecution statewide. A model? The district attorney's office is using your father's documentation methods as a training example for prosecutors across the state. They're teaching other attorneys how to build comprehensive elder abuse cases using Harold's approach to evidence preservation. Dad would like that. The state legislature is also considering new protections for vulnerable adults, partly inspired by this case. Margaret's sophisticated exploitation highlighted gaps in the current legal framework that need to be addressed. I thought about that as I drove home to my new apartment downtown. Margaret was 6 months into her prison sentence at the Women's Correctional Facility outside Albany. I'd filed for divorce while she was awaiting trial, and it had been finalized 4 months ago. The house we'd shared was sold as part of the asset recovery process, with proceeds going toward restitution. I'd bought a smaller place near Uncle James and cousin Sarah, who'd become regular parts of my life again. We had dinner every Sunday, often joined by other family members who'd been systematically excluded during Dad's illness. Aunt Dorothy visited monthly, and we'd planned a memorial trip to Ireland for next spring, the trip Dad had always wanted to take but never got the chance. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Elizabeth Santos, who I'd been dating for the past 6 months. She'd been Dad's oncologist and had supported me through the legal proceedings when she realized how Margaret had manipulated the medical care situation. How did the foundation signing go? All done. Official launch next month. Proud of you. Dinner tonight to celebrate. Absolutely. Romano's at 7? Perfect. Love you. Elizabeth and I had started talking during the criminal investigation, when she'd provided testimony about Margaret's systematic exclusion of me from medical decisions. What began as professional consultation had gradually developed into something deeper. She understood grief, loss, and the complex emotions surrounding medical care in ways that felt natural and unforced. The Harold Vance Foundation would provide multiple services: legal assistance for families dealing with elder abuse, educational resources for healthcare providers to recognize manipulation tactics, support groups for relatives who'd been isolated from elderly family members, and advocacy for stronger legal protections for vulnerable adults. Dad's final year had been stolen from us by someone we both trusted completely. But maybe we could help other families avoid the same devastation. The foundation would be Dad's real legacy, not the money Margaret had tried to steal, but the knowledge and protection that could prevent future exploitation. I pulled into the parking lot at Romano's, the same restaurant where Margaret had first told Dad how emotionally unavailable I was, according to the emails I'd read that devastating night 8 months ago. Now it would be where Elizabeth and I celebrated the foundation that would help other families stay connected during their darkest hours. Inside, I found Elizabeth waiting at a corner table, her smile warm and genuine. She stood to hug me, and I felt the contrast with Margaret's calculated affection. Elizabeth's warmth came without agenda or manipulation. "So it's official?" she asked as we sat down. "Completely official. The Harold Vance Foundation is a recognized nonprofit organization as of this afternoon. Tell me about the first seminar. Elder Abuse Recognition and Prevention, aimed at healthcare workers, legal professionals, and family members. We'll teach people how to spot the warning signs that Margaret exploited so effectively. Like isolation tactics? Exactly. How perpetrators systematically exclude family members from medical decisions while positioning themselves as the only caring advocate. How they use medical complexity to justify controlling information flow. How they exploit the emotional vulnerability of both patients and relatives. Elizabeth reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Your dad would be so proud of what you've built from this tragedy. I hope so. I think he'd be amazed that his final gift accomplished so much more than just exposing Margaret's crimes. What do you mean? Cross told me today that our case is being used as a training example for prosecutors statewide. Dad's documentation methods are teaching other attorneys how to build comprehensive elder abuse cases. The state legislature is considering new legal protections inspired by what happened to us. So Harold's final act is protecting other families too. That would be exactly like him. Dad always thought about legacy, about building something that would help the next generation. We ordered dinner and talked about the foundation's future plans. Elizabeth had volunteered to serve on the medical advisory board, helping develop training materials for healthcare providers. Her experience with Dad's case had shown her how easily medical professionals could be manipulated by seemingly caring family members with hidden agendas. I keep thinking about all the appointments Margaret attended alone, Elizabeth said, how she positioned herself as Harold's primary advocate while systematically excluding you from medical decisions. If I'd been more suspicious of her motives, maybe I could have prevented some of the isolation. You couldn't have known. Margaret was a professional paralegal who understood exactly how to exploit the system. She knew which words to use, which forms to file, which procedures to follow. She made everything seem legitimate and caring. That's what makes it so dangerous. Elder abuse isn't always obvious physical neglect or financial exploitation. Sometimes it's sophisticated psychological manipulation by people who understand how to work within the system. After dinner, we walked through downtown Springfield, past the construction sites where I'd learned the business alongside Dad during high school summers. The work felt different now, more meaningful, connected to something larger than individual projects. "Have you heard anything about Margaret recently?" Elizabeth asked as we reached my apartment building. "She's 6 months into her sentence. Her attorney filed an appeal, but Cross says it won't succeed. The evidence was too comprehensive and the plea bargain was actually generous considering the charges she was facing. Do you think she understands what she did wrong? I think she understands that she got caught. Whether she comprehends the emotional devastation she caused is another question entirely. Will you visit her? No. Margaret made her choices over 2 years of systematic deception. She chose to manipulate my dying father instead of supporting our family honestly. She chose to steal from him while conducting an emotional affair. She chose to isolate him from relatives who loved him. Those weren't mistakes or misunderstandings. They were calculated decisions. Do you think she ever really loved you? I considered the question as we reached my door. I think Margaret loved the idea of me. The stable marriage, the financial security, the social status of being married to a successful engineer. But love requires honesty and respect, and she was incapable of both. And now? Now I understand what real love looks like. It looks like your support during the investigation when you realized how you'd been manipulated too. It looks like Uncle James and Cousin Sarah rebuilding relationships that Margaret had systematically destroyed. It looks like Dad's final gift of evidence that exposed the truth and set me free. Elizabeth kissed me goodnight, and I watched her drive away before heading upstairs to my apartment. Tomorrow would bring the final preparations for the Foundation's first seminar on elder abuse prevention. Next week, I'd meet with prosecutors from other counties who wanted to learn Dad's documentation methods. Next month, Elizabeth and I would travel to a conference on vulnerable adult protection to present our case study. But tonight, I sat in my living room looking at the incorporation papers for the Harold Vance Foundation, thinking about Dad's final note. He'd written that his last gift was the truth, and that perhaps it could set me free. He'd been right about that, but the truth had accomplished so much more. The truth had exposed Margaret's systematic manipulation and led to comprehensive justice. The truth had restored my relationships with family members who'd been deliberately excluded from Dad's care. The truth had revealed that I'd been a good son who'd been systematically isolated, not an absent workaholic who'd abandoned his dying father. Most importantly, the truth had created a foundation that would help other families stay connected during medical crises, prevent sophisticated financial exploitation, and ensure that vulnerable adults receive genuine care instead of calculated manipulation. Margaret had stolen 2 years of my relationship with Dad, but she hadn't stolen his final gift. That gift, the truth preserved through careful documentation, had set me free and would continue protecting other families for years to come. I filed the foundation papers in my desk drawer, next to the USB drive that had started this journey. Tomorrow, Dad's legacy would begin helping other families avoid the devastation Margaret had caused. His final act of love would protect countless other vulnerable adults from sophisticated predators who exploit trust for personal gain. Margaret was serving her sentence, her life and career destroyed by the choices she'd made. But Dad's final gift was just beginning to bear fruit. Truth, justice, and protection for the vulnerable. Exactly the kind of legacy he would have wanted to leave behind.